Well, hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. We'll be discussing today how to operationalize real-world data linking to benefit clinical research. I'm Vera Muchai, I'm Head of Trials and Chief Scientist here at Datavant, and today I'll be your moderator as we discuss this important topic of data connectivity, especially as it pertains to clinical trials and clinical developments. I'm joined today by two fantastic panelists and I'll let them introduce themselves. Michelle, how about we start with you?
Thanks, Vera. Michelle Hoyseth, Chief Data Officer at Parexel, and as part of that role, a major part of that role, we are responsible for our real-world data-enabled solutions.
Wonderful. Thanks, Michelle. Welcome. And Sid?
Good afternoon, all. I'm Sid Jain, Head of Data Science Strategy and Portfolio for the Global Development Function at Janssen R&D. I'm responsible for all data science activities within our clinical trial operations. Also happen to be leading our real-world data linkage efforts. Glad to be here.
Wonderful. Glad to have you here as well. So yeah, this is going to be an exciting conversation. We have both the CRO side and the pharma sponsor side to talk about data linkage and data connectivity. But before we get into the conversation itself, I also want to acknowledge that we also have quite the group of attendees that are listening into this conversation and want to make sure that the conversation that we're having today is as collaborative and includes all of you in it. So if you look at the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom panel, you'll see a widget that says Q&A. Throughout the presentation, we encourage anybody who's in the audience to ask any questions and be part of the discussion. And we'll get to those either during the conversation or at the end of it. And if we don't have enough time to get to all of the questions, we will follow up with you directly after this webinar. So to get us all started, Michelle, would love to get started with your perspective on today's environment around data connectivity for clinical trials. What's happening today, and then what could be the potential for the future?
Right. So, I think, Vera, it's helpful if we sort of start with the need that we face as an industry, what's ahead of us. So I think we all recognize that the time and cost trajectory to develop therapies for patients is not sustainable. We're looking at, 12 to 15 years, $2.5 to $3 billion per compound today on a trajectory to be 20 billion in the coming years. So we have to really look as innovatively at the operational methods we use to develop medicines as those that we use to discover and bring the medicines from bench to bedside anyways. So our opportunity to interfere with the current trajectory really is sitting with the way that we use healthcare data, the way we use clinical study data, and the enabling technologies. It's probably the most real opportunity we've had as we've started to have this discussion over the 10 years. The data access is there, and the enabling technologies at a state of maturity where we can really shift the way that we leverage data. So, a lot of the discussion right now has been around leveraging healthcare data in life science applications, claims data, pharmacy data, other patient registry data, just to name a few. But that while that is an important area that we need to leverage differently, we also need to think equally about the clinical study data that we create and how do we enable that in parallel so that we really are developing longitudinal data assets, either around patient, indications, assets, whatever might be the suitable approach. The last bit, I think, to have on the table for today's discussion about the environment is the shift in the regulatory position on the use of data. So we know we've got preliminary guidance from FDA, we've got EMA taking a stance around the use of existing registry data and the promotion of data access. We're having different conversations today than we've had in our past around GDPR and data privacy and how to leverage healthcare data for the greater good while respecting the privacy of our patients. And so, the need, both from a time and cost perspective, but also just to do a better job for patients, just to have a better handle on what happens as compounds move from, controlled clinical study environments into the real world, et cetera. How do we how do we do a more complete job and provide more impactful therapy?
Absolutely, and yeah, that's $20 billion. It's quite a staggering number. And then if you think about like how that amplifies across the healthcare ecosystem. So we talked a little bit about the environment that's changing, and one of the things that we've discussed is that this environment actually is allowing for being able to have that really holistic view of the patient through data linkage. And we'll talk a little bit about how that happens technologically a little down the line. But Sid, I'm curious, as we're thinking about this environment and those changes, why would a sponsor be interested in data linkage and in doing more with data?
Yeah, I guess the question would be why not, right? Just piggyback on what Michelle said, the regulatory environment is changing, especially with the 21st Century Cures Act. And if you assume real world data and real world evidence is here to stay, data linkage is there to stay. And now it's more of a question of moving beyond data linkage within different modalities, EHR, claims, labs, to actually now start to link the RCT data, the randomized control trial data, and create that powerful baseline cohort that can carry on. And with the right, just again, all this is predicated on protecting patient or participant privacy, making sure all the right safeguards in place, keeping it unidentifiable. So once you assume that baseline is there, the benefit to the research are significant. So I guess going back to why not.
Absolutely, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the use cases where this clinical trial data linkage to real world data really can help enhance how we do clinical development. Yep. And before we get there, actually, I wanted to talk a bit about the technology behind it. So Sid mentioned, the data linkage needs to be done in a way that protects patient privacy. And I think this whole group agrees that that is priority number one. Any innovation that we make needs to be done with that in mind. Perhaps part of this group is familiar already with the term of trial tokenization or tokenization in general, and perhaps not. So I thought I'd step back a little bit and talk about the technology and what Datavant does. So for those of you who are not familiar with Datavant, our mission is connecting the world's health data to improve patient outcomes. And the technology that we use to be able to empower this is what's called tokenization. A token is essentially, very simply, a universal de-identified ID that can be used to connect healthcare data at the patient level in a way that preserves that patient privacy. So you can think of it as an ID that represents an individual, is persistent across different healthcare data sources, the claims, lab, clinical trial data, and it's Datavant's way of creating a de-identified longitudinal patient healthcare data set. So with that in mind, as we're talking about, again, this ability to now connect clinical trial data to the rest of the real world data, I wanted to take the conversation there. How are tokens used in clinical trials, and what kind of use cases have you seen or do you envision supporting? And let's start with Sid, and then we'll go on with Michelle.
Yeah, one of the biggest advantages we see of tokenizing data is creating that longitudinal view of the participants and the patients. And that starts even before the trial starts. So even today, during screening, as the patients are getting enrolled, we do collect baseline data, but that's all in most cases based on memory, right? So as you can imagine how well that goes. Now being able to tokenize the data and being able to link that both historically, during study, and prospectively, we think, again, with the proper consent, with proper privacy safeguards in place, we think is the way to go. And that just creates that rich set of data throughout, especially as we look at some of these new therapies emerging, CAR T and others, where the longer term follow-up is going to be essential. We see that as a win-win for the patients, for the research, and creates that tremendous asset going forward that can answer various questions. Long-term follow-up obviously comes to mind, and that's top of mind. But then there are use cases beyond that. Real world data is not perfect, so being able to calibrate that using RCT data. So we have several studies. COVID provided us that impetus to push forward in this area, but we see tremendous opportunities going forward too.
So picking up from Sid, again, we're here in service to patients, right? And if we look at the patient experience in clinical research today, the burden is high and the reward for their participation can be low for them. And so if we look at smart ways to deploy tokenization, if we call out a rare disease population, right? Tokenized data from their standard of care clinical setting combined with perhaps a reduced burden of protocol specific data allows us to develop the complete data set that we need to understand that patient's journey to their diagnosis, the impact of prior therapies that they've been on, and the impact of the investigational therapy in a more complete way that really reduces the burden of, by definition, a rare disease patient having to get on a plane to go to a clinic visit, right? It allows us also, if we're smart, it allows us then to follow that patient through perhaps, let's say the compound is safe and effective, through expanded access, through into, post-market authorization, prescribing environment care. And we can begin to understand more about that rare disease population at large, right? And interrogate that and answer additional questions. When we want to get serious about precision medicine, right? And precision medicine at scale, how do we find these patients? How do we see them in the biomarker and genomic data sets? It's one thing to be able to say there's a higher percentage of, BRCA positive patients being treated at this center and another center, and answering the question at that level, then to combine those data with some clinical data and be able to say, and yes, they're on third line therapy, and yes, they've had, maybe they're out of remission, or to be able to understand a more complete picture of the patient and have a more appropriate approach to finding those patients. When I think also about our responsibility to address time and cost for patients, right? We need to be able to answer more questions with the data that we have, and we need to reduce our dependency to stand up a brand new study every single time we have a new question that requires clinicians to go abstract data from somewhere else and put it in a UC system for analysis. That's not really in service to the patient. And the last bit is what happens to patients, after they complete studies. Patient advisory groups and patient councils have openly told us that it's almost like a grievance, that they grieve the exit out of the study where they've had this intensive care and back into their standard of care environment. And it frustrates them tremendously that the experience and the data from on their status from the study doesn't follow them back into the standard of care. Data linking can take care of a lot of these things and allow us to do a better job.
Yeah, and this is where the advantage of that multimodal data linkage is essential, right? You're not just looking at not all the patient data, as we know, is collected in the EHR. So that's where this multimodal data linkage of linking it from different labs, from the data that's coming from claims, that's where the true complete picture comes, and being able to track that over long term and detect signals as needed, and spin up different studies to answer very specific questions of interest at that time, rather than having to keep bring the patient or the participant back into the facility. I think that's a great point around reducing burden, both on patients and on sites. I think both are essential.
Right. Absolutely. So as I'm hearing the conversation here, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a rare disease patient. Let's say somebody who has a rare cancer and has the opportunity to be treated with novel technologies such as a CAR T cell. So that person goes into the trial, they probably have seen dozens of physicians in dozens of institutions before that. I've heard of stories of people who bring papers of medical records with them to make sure that they remember the entire story. I think what you guys are trying to do here, eliminates that need and makes the medical history of a patient come in sort of in a more structured, in a more frictionless way. But then, as Sid was mentioning earlier, you get a CAR T treatment approved today that is bleeding edge technology that's been done very rarely. Regulators will require that these patients are seen for 10, 15 years down the line. But as a trial participant, you also have a life. You move from one state to another. You do something else. You see different physicians. Coming back to the original site where you did your treatment to ensure that there's been no adverse long-term effects. Doing that 10 years down the line is burdensome to both the site and to the patient. So I'm very excited to see what this opportunity will uncover for those patients and also for the rest of the population that gets into clinical trials and hopefully encourage more folks to participate in clinical trials, because now that some of that burden has been lifted. And speaking of operational burdens, every time there's a new technology that's provided into a clinical trial, including data linkage, there's a lot that needs to be set up to make sure that this is implemented successfully. And Michelle, putting your operational hat here, could you tell the audience a bit about how this actually works in the clinical trial setting and what Parexel has put in place to operationalize this?
Yeah, I think probably just from our prior conversations, Sid, I think we both started with the back end focus, right? How do we handle the tokenized data, and what does it allow us to do with the data set, right? But interestingly, from a data operations perspective, to the team, it's another form of coded data, right? Handling the data, yeah, there's a little difference in the plumbing. There's a lot of difference in the data science and what you need to know about the data. It's not, EDC captured data. Normalization can be, a bit of a trick and not for the faint-hearted. But it's not really a dramatic departure from the way that they're used to working. It's a new data type in a set of, processes, et cetera, that are actually adaptable to it. The big impact and the thing that surprised us was the site impact and the impact on CRAs, right? So there's much more of a front end impact where you've got life science folks, clinician types, right, who are now being asked to speak to sites around, an emerging technology, emerging in our space, I should say. I want to, acknowledge that tokenization happens to all of our data all the time in finance and other places. It's not new, but it's new to our space. To help sites understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, to help patients understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, to determine based on our organizational structures and our responsibilities, what is the burden of informed consent and patient notification? How do we deal with things like the right to be forgotten that patients have, or all, people have with their data? And so both creating processes that were as lightweight and intuitive as possible, so they're not disruptive to the clinical study startup process, and providing the right support around, to the people who need to kind of represent the capability, out into the clinical research community was the biggest impact, and is still requiring months of effort, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. It's when we think of operations, data operations is one thing, and to Michelle's point, that's work, but we know how to do it. There's enough talent to do it. But it's more the actual operations at the site, the patient level, and this is a new concept. Like Michelle said, not a new concept in the industry, just data tokenization, data linkage, but especially when you're thinking about linking it to the trial population data, that is a new concept. Participating in the trial itself takes convincing for the right reasons. to then ask to consent for this additional data linkage that requires proper education and understanding of what is going to be done with the data, and the privacy protection. Again, I might be repeating myself too much on that, but I can't repeat myself too much on that. It's making sure they understand, and also the sites, because ultimately they're the ones who have to talk to these patients and convey the importance of this research, this data. So arming them with the right tools and answers is important. First, answering their questions, and then arming them with the right set of tools and answers for the patients. That's just absolutely critical for this to be successful.
We do find ourselves in a probably, I guess, the most effective way is a bit of a super user community kind of construct, as comfort and both, awareness, knowledge, and comfort kind of, move, the workforce kind of moves through that scale. Interestingly, there's two other interesting components, I think. One is we are very technology enabled as members of society, right? We'll lean forward and download apps onto our smartphones, and we'll do this and we'll do that, and we'll figure ourselves out, right? That stance doesn't really exist at the same level in our professional lives. And so the support that we need as we're introducing new technologies, I think, is higher. There's, also the assurance of regulatory compliance as regulated industry. So we keep having to hit that, over and over again. But the last piece is really ethics, and ethics around the patients and their data. And honestly, do the patients understand at an appropriate level what they're consenting to, the permission they're given? Are they comfortable with it? Do they see the greater good and the value? How do we empower them from there? And have we done the right job telling them, for example, what we're not going to do with their data, in as much as why we want to be able to use their data? And we've talked about, none of us want to, be guests on 60 Minutes, right? Or, we don't want to be, with the GAFA 4 that we use data and know somebody's habits in a way that really invades their privacy. But worse yet is not using the data to promote health and wellness in a population, right? Not creating good is maybe for more commercial interests. So we have to be really careful as an industry, how we step into this space, and we can't make those mistakes.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think transparency is key, and making sure that patients, participants, investigators, they all understand where the data is coming from, what's happening to that data, and where are we going to use that data for, right? So those are critical components. And I think part of that is, I repeat again, on the education front is important, because some of this, there is that initial, I would even say pushback, because sites would think you need to directly link into the EHR or other systems, etc. And there may be use cases where that might be necessary, but for most part, that's not the case, right? So again, some of those operational challenges can be handled through proper education, but it still is an evolving area. It's going to take some time, but the benefits are immense. So there's a reason to keep pushing.
Absolutely. I underscore the benefits are immense. So there's a reason to keep pushing. But as we're talking about the data and what's done with them, in this space, we hear a lot about selecting certain types of real world data that's fit for purpose. But I also think about the fact that the purpose also needs to be fit for ethical scientific research that we do. And I think part of educating, certainly the trial participants, informed consent involves information, educating the participants, educating the sites, and educating the PIs, the principal investigators who are running these trials, is certainly part of this. And Michelle, I know that Parexel has a wealth of documentation and information here for each of those types of stakeholders.
Yeah. And you touched on there's a nuance in there, right? Which is the way that we partner with ethics committees and IRBs, right? there's definitely, all of us are stepping into this space together, right? We see the value. We're fairly clear-eyed on why we need to go in this direction and what we can do, what it'll allow us to do. But, you know, innovation's messy. And while you're solving for all those problems, you know, it's happened before, and we're at risk of it happening, that we kind of lose our compass heading and where we're going. Embedded interactions with IRBs and ethics committees, right, who are also figuring out how they need to be thinking about, you know, the future use of data for research, right, has been really, really helpful. And, you know, it has kind of kept us on that fine line of, you know, how much additional process would you add, that not necessarily because it's regulated or required, but it's ethical and appropriate for patients, and keep us forward in that way.
Absolutely. So we have a couple of questions from the audience, and we can, some of them are more technical and some of them are more about the high level. So I wanted to start with a question from Sean here about what success looks like in this area. So we talked a bit about the tokenization components, but there's also the data linkage. So assuming the holistic, you know, clinical trial plus real world data connection has happened, what does success look like to you, Sid, on the sponsor side?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the data that gets tokenized and then eventually linked, are we getting sufficient data coverage on that for it to have to be able to do meaningful research, right? Because that's the ultimate goal. And so we, you know, given our foray, or industry's foray, and this was very recent, what I would say is our first experience from being able to get the right sample size and you know, having that consented population, and then being able to link it to this multimodal data sources. The answer is we've been successful because we have a fairly substantial cohort at this point for the studies we've tokenized that are meaningful, and then the linkage with real world data has been pretty high, and without actually impacting the site, or without having to go in and connect into the EHR directly, but just using the existing aggregated data sources. We've had a fair amount of success in being able to find the right overlapping data sets and population, and we're in the middle of conducting that research. So more on that in the coming weeks and months. But as of now, we've hit our success criteria that we set out with.
Excellent. And then Michelle, on the operational side, are there any metrics or any you know, points that you would consider really tell you what success looks like?
Yeah, so in terms of capabilities, you know, one of the linked data sets helped the manufacturer, the sponsor, avoid 2 prospective follow-up studies. So think more like a registry design is what it replaced. The other area where there's been a lot of impact is in post-authorization safety surveillance, right? You can see a much more robust way to follow patients over time, and you know, and meet those requirements in a way that allows you to avoid some of the issues around loss to follow-up. And, you know, to your point, patients move, they leave, they you know, choose not to participate, which can really create some holes in what we're doing. So, you know, it's capabilities like those, I think, that are really enhanced. The other example, and this is actually being run as much as a proof of concept, you know, it's sort of like live fire proof of concept sort of setting, but really trying to look at the impact of decentralized clinical trials, EMRs, and wearables as sources of data, and how much can we facilitate the back end accurately with good precision through the tokens. And you know, that exercise, I think, has also been fruitful. It's allowed us to begin to understand some areas of unmet need that this patient population has, what concerns them around their condition, their therapies in current state, and I think could really help inform, clinical development objectives for next generation compounds.
Excellent, thank you. So I wanted to switch gear a little bit and talk about sort of the last topic of conversation here, which is around regulatory considerations, and then we'll move on to questions. So we've mentioned the FDA, we've mentioned HIPAA, we've mentioned GDPR so far. So if we take something like HIPAA, the privacy rules that we have in the United States, I'd love for the group to talk about the considerations that are taken there as you undergo this research.
Yeah.
So,
go ahead, Michelle.
I was just going to open Sid to say, anonymized data is excluded from HIPAA, but we have.
Sorry to hear about that.
So there's a participant who's not muted.
Doesn't look like we have everybody that we should.
Let me see if I can fix that.
Yeah, are we okay?
Should be good, yeah. Sorry about that.
So, therefore, because it's excluded, we could technically say that HIPAA doesn't apply, but it goes back to the ethical stance, right? Maybe the law does not technically apply, but we still have an ethical obligation to let patients know what we're up to and why we want to do it. And are they okay with it?
Yeah. I would agree with that. I think it's we have taken the more conservative position, and for the foreseeable future will continue to, that consent is required. So even though the ecosystem is evolving and we'll continue to monitor, but at the end of the day, if there's gray, we want to be in the black and white, so we want to make sure that ultimately it's for the benefit of research for patients, but then just continue to make sure that we're taking the most conservative interpretation of the regulations and HIPAA and GDPR and making sure we're staying on the right side of this, to be frank.
Yeah.
Totally.
There, just to connect two dots, two discussion points that are very active hot topics in our industry right now. We have an obligation to report back results to patients now after studies are completed, and it is in service to patients, right? We're kind of crude in the way that we do it today. We're not very sophisticated, but the idea is to respect that they should hear something back from their participation, understand what happened to that study, right? If I apply that here, we kind of have a trust problem. I think we would all agree in our industry right now, and look at like the trust around the COVID vaccines and the amount of extra work that has gone into helping the general public understand safety and effectiveness. If we tell patients that we're going to use their data for future research and they trust us to create, to do good things with that, I think we have a question we have to answer together about how we're going to come back to those, the people who and the general public, and show them that we're creating value. Whether that shows up ultimately in a cost to develop or timeline or patients having access to critical treatments, we need to think about that. But we do have to be able to come to a point of maturity here where we're able to thank people and show them the value that was created from their, the permissions they gave.
Yeah, being able to share back, so participants rather share the gift of time, sharing back the gift of insight for them and for the rest of the population that might end up in an intervention that gets approved in the future. That's I would say the holy grail of this type of work. There's actually, Sid, did you have a comment there?
Yeah, I'm good. But I mean, I was just looking at one question also, which is around which therapeutic areas might benefit most. So I was just going to take that for a second. And I mean, I feel like almost all therapeutic areas can benefit, but definitely, as we discussed in the beginning, any of the emerging therapies in rare diseases, et cetera, where we see the need for long-term follow-up, seem prime to benefit from that. We're also seeing when it comes to, ID infectious disease, because of the broad data coverage, easily available from some of the larger modalities like claim, CHR, et cetera. I think those tend to benefit right now as well. But I think in general, we see broader benefit across here.
And Sid, you read my mind. I was going to go to some of the questions, starting with that one around the therapeutic area. So thank you for taking it. There's a couple of other questions here that are around more of the technical feasibility of what we do. And as we were talking about HIPAA, actually, I see that Estelle's asking about de-identification and the de-identified token. And how this actually works. So if a token is used to link across different data sets, how do you ensure that the combined data set remains de-identified? So perhaps this is a topic for another conversation, but there's a lot of de-identification operations that happen to a healthcare data set to be considered HIPAA certified de-identified, removing certain personal information, rolling up some other information to make sure that nothing is granular enough that you could accidentally re-identify someone. And there's actually a group of experts that are called expert certifiers that ensure that a combined data set has very low risk of re-identification for these patients. So certainly within HIPAA, there's guidance and there's regulation that we all follow to make sure that these combined data sets remain de-identified and that the privacy protection is preserved for our participants and for any individual in these healthcare records. There's also a couple of other questions here around accuracy. And Sid, you were talking about earlier the metrics. Making sure that you have enough of an overlap of data set A to data set B, but also that there's some questions around the precision and the recall there. And I'm very happy to say that at least through Datavant, we've done research that shows that with the right combinations here, you can have up to 99% precision and recall. But certainly that will depend on the data set. There might be some data sets that have more patient information and some that have less, and that will change. But is that something that I know data scientists on your team probably think a lot about, Sid?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's to your point. So far, we've been happy with that. I think some of that over time would continue to monitor. So yeah, agree. That's one of the other metrics we need to keep tracking.
Great. And then there's actually a couple other questions sort of on thinking about the regulatory perspective. So we talked about HIPAA. The FDA is something that we mentioned at the beginning with the 21st Century Cures Act. And I'm curious to hear, so we talked about the participants, the sites, the sponsor, the CROs, the regulators, the FDA. How are they involved in bringing this space forward, and how do we think about those interactions?
Yeah, so I think it starts with even before RCT to RWD data linkage, the real world data linkage has existed, right? And so real world evidence, we already touched on some of this. FDA is almost encouraging the use of real world data in submissions at this point, and label expansions or whatnot. So even though it varies from one part of the FDA to another, but in general, there is a trend towards acceptance of RWE, right? And with that, I would say tacit acceptance of this linkage of data. And so far, we've not seen any pushback, at least on the data linkage part and how that comes together. Even for tokenization within trial, frankly, with the right rationale, when it comes to IRBs and other, we have not seen any pushback. In fact, have seen encouragement. So I think it's moving in the right direction, but there's always going to be some bumps along the way. But for most part, we see it as being encouraged.
Any additional thoughts on the regulatory side, Michelle?
No, I mean, I think, FDA would tell you they've used real world data for a long time in safety, right? So there's a foundation there. It's about the expanded use. And, certainly the types of talent that the agency is focused on hiring in, and the EMA as well, right? MHRA. to ready themselves for supporting the use of real world data is, it's been a very concerted effort. And an openly discussed one, I would say, too. Even when I think about the discussions at DIA, where we've got FDA biostatisticians talking about, skills and talent and where they need to head to be able to use data more completely and get a more complete handle on the impact of, medicines, medical devices on patients. It feels like we're all swimming in in the same direction. That said, there's other things in the water with us, some of which we see and some of which we don't, that we need to sort out together. But there's a willingness to partner and be open, I think, with industry that we absolutely have to support and participate in.
Absolutely. Great. So in terms of summarizing and kind of getting towards wrapping the conversation up here. So we've talked a lot about the benefits of data linkage and how they can really help turbocharge how we run clinical trials and how we do clinical development. I'd like for the both of you to put yourselves 5 years down the line and think about a universe where this has worked really well, and now trial tokenization, linking clinical trial data to real world data is something that's found in master protocols for all of our clinical trials. So I have 2 questions for each of you. Number 1 is, what has happened to get us there? And hopefully how we will get there. And number 2, what is one insight that each of your groups has gathered because that has happened? Let's start with Michelle.
So what has happened to get us there is that we let the data that we intend to use influence the protocol design instead of the other way around. That would be one big thing that would allow us to really leverage data. Another thing that would have happened to get us there is that we reach a balanced position on data privacy and the use of enabling technologies outside of the US, because none of us develop therapies for a single state or country, or very few of us do. We develop therapies worldwide, and we need to be able to leverage representative data against all of the intended treated populations. And then the second question, I lost it already, Vera.
So the second question is, because we've had trial tokenization happening across all of the trials that, let's say, Parexel supports, what insights have you been able to gather because of it?
Yeah, so I think we would understand responder attributes better so that patients are better matched to the therapies that matter to them. We would have a better handle on long-range outcomes, other variables that emerge in a patient's overall sense of well-being. If I could pick up Gajinder's question around things like mental health, sexual disease, sensitive sorts of indications, we would, I think be able to look at a broader sample of these otherwise shy patient populations and understand what happens to them and the impact of therapies better while preserving their privacy, given the sensitivity of some of their diagnoses. Among the many other things that we talked about as benefits earlier today.
Yeah, I would pick up on that first and then answer your first question in terms of where we want to, what we see 5 years down the road is, randomized controlled trials are kept pristine for a reason. They're done in a controlled environment for a reason, and that would not go away. Nothing replaces randomized controlled trials, but being able to start much earlier in the process, and by linking the RCT to RWD and detecting those signals much earlier and starting that longer term follow-up and sort of phase 4 post-marketing studies, not waiting for those, but starting to detect those signals much earlier in the process. That to me would, is among many benefits, is going to be one of the benefits. But then starting to see, what the treatment and how it's faring in the real world so much earlier, I think just benefits the research portfolio in a very significant way, that I start to see the trends emerging much sooner than later. Now, in terms of what it takes to get us there, to be able to have a more complete portfolio, be tokenized, linked, and all that, we obviously need partners like you guys to be able to continue to create the right technologies, the right infrastructure, and the secure manner in which we can continue to do this. So that's happening. We do need to continue to scale both operationally and from a data access perspective, how we benefit from that linkage, and continue to enhance the research. So it's we're just starting there, but and there's going to be tremendous effort and push required to make this a broader part of our portfolio. But I think at Janssen, we're pretty committed to do that.
Wonderful, thank you. And in terms of, I guess if I were to answer that question from my perspective, I think what has happened is, again, that there's sponsors and there's CROs who have pushed the field forward and has seen benefit out of it and have shared that benefit with the patients, and that the real world data ecosystem is there to satisfy the types of use cases that you want to follow on, and what we can do with it. I mean, in my mind, it's a little bit of everything. Getting new drugs to market that might not have gotten there, getting them to market faster, drug repurposing, and being able to really have insightful information on which patients are more likely to be or benefit more for a particular indication. I think all of that is possible if we're really able to unleash the power of our clinical trials. The other thing that's I hope we can all benefit from this, and I see Michelle, you wanted to comment a little bit on the trial diversity for one of the Q&As, is we get more people to join clinical trials. I've heard a lot of statistics, but one that's I heard the most is about 3 to 5% of the population even participates in clinical trials. So I'd like to see how 5 years from now we've doubled, tripled, or more that number. And Michelle, if you had any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, trials, it's remarkable now that we've started to look how different trial populations can look to the underlying patient population, right? And so being able to have a more complete view into the patient status. Part of the reason that happens is we can see the high level stats, the characteristics of, a disease population, but we can't see enough granularity in the data to understand which portions of that population are suitable for study or not, against the protocol design. That linkage could allow us to have the visibility and assess our protocols differently as it relates to representativeness, right? And it would also allow us to see that certain ethnicities respond differently and begin to interrogate why that is. And both of those things are critically important.
Yeah, and I would say beyond just within trial linkage, just the fact that the linked data exists today across different modalities, that does allow us to identify, the right patient population who would benefit from, who we're targeting to benefit from the research. So being able to, this is where precision medicine starts to come together with the right set of data linkages and identifying a patient population that as you go through the funnel of your inclusion exclusion criteria, but then really being very specific on specific biomarkers or specific subpopulation that you're looking for. Again, I think this is where there's tremendous benefit of the linked data modalities.
Great. So as we're nearing the top of the hour, I just wanted to summarize with some of the reflections that I jotted down as we were having this conversation. So first of all, again, going back to the staggering numbers at the beginning, if we're about to spend $20 billion for any new compound that goes to market, things need to change. Trials, we need to get more out of the great research that's happening preclinically and clinically. But we do have the environment and the technology and the data to be able to do more now. So I'm glad that this group is excited for wanting to do more of that. And then the other thing that we discussed is this whole idea that sites, PIs, participants themselves, the burden is high for being in a clinical trial, and sometimes the reward is relatively low. So we're thinking about how in the future we can flip that scale and make sure that everybody who volunteers their time and their efforts to be part of a clinical trial really benefits themselves, but also the general population that receives an intervention. And we certainly talked about how technology can help here, and how for the first time ever, really, we're seeing the connection of clinical trial data to real world data to generate that kind of evidence that will really improve patient lives. And I'm so thrilled that I'm able to contribute to this kind of work with folks like Sid, Jane, and Michelle, who is up here, and others. And I wanted to thank our panelists for their time today and for their insights, and hope we can have another conversation down the line where we talk about results and impacts that some of these initiatives have had. And also wanted to thank the audience today. This webinar is recorded and will be sent out to everyone upon completion. So with that, again, thanks, Sid. Thanks so much, Michelle. Hope everybody has a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Vera. It's
Bye-bye.
been great.
Yep.
Pleasure.